Chapter 1. This story takes place in Seoul, in the year 2033, where we see that the world is in a biological crisis because humans are constantly being attacked by entities called bugs. And although an organization known as the Garden has tried to control mutation with its army of butterflies soldiers, the number of troops on the battlefield is not enough to defeat all the bugs. Meanwhile, we meet the main character, Miwa Beek, a young 15-year-old student who, from what we are told, suffered an accident that caused him to lose much of his memories. So now he is trying to start his new life as a high school student. His sister Hyuna asks him if he enjoys going to school, even though he always has to be careful not to release that which only the two of them know. Miwa replies that he does take all this into account, and at school, we see how he tries to go about his day in peace, intending to become the most popular in the class. Later in class, the teacher starts talking about the year 2020, which was the time when the bugs first appeared. In a flashback, we are told that it all happened 13 years ago in New York City, this being the place where the first bug was generated. The government of that time tried to kill the beast, but none of the nuclear weapons or attacks could kill it. This is when the most recognized institute in biological advances, known as URIBS, used a device that was supposed to kill the bug but only created more destruction because it ended up fragmented into even smaller and deadlier monsters. In the end, in less than a day, almost 100% of the population disappeared, except for the city of Seoul, since the URIBS division residing in the district anticipated the side effects of the attack, creating a barrier that would protect them from the deadly gas generated by these little bugs. But the incident did not end there, as some time later the monsters arrived in the city to kill its residents. However, before continuing with the explanation, the class is interrupted by a student, who comes to warn that a butterfly is in the area, as it is fighting a bug. We soon learn that it is none other than the one known as the first of all, Jaeyoung Shin. During the fight, Miwa remembers that many years ago, when his region was under attack, a beautiful girl with butterfly wings came down from the sky to disintegrate the beasts. Her fighting style along with her beauty was enough to earn her the name Butterfly Goddess, but the numerous attacks on the city ended up taking the life of this girl. After her death, the K-Ribs, or currently known as the Garden, set in motion her experiment to create a new butterfly goddess using the blood of her predecessor. Surprisingly, the research was successful in creating what is now known as the Butterfly Army, Jaeyoung being its first functional soldier against the bugs. The next day, during sports class, some boys decide to trick their teacher so they can sneak out for a while. Once in the classroom, they pass the time while watching a live broadcast of a battle going on somewhere in the city. Mysteriously, one of the boys' cell phones goes off, so he goes to Miwa to get his tablet to continue the streaming. During the struggle, the boy sees that the protagonist's hand is wounded with a kind of cut, to which Miwa tries to explain that he does not understand why he has that scar either, since the only thing that has always been said to him is that he is forbidden to bleed. The group of abusers begins to laugh at his condition, so to check if what he has said is true, they use a knife to cut a cheek. Suddenly, the atmosphere becomes quite tense, and the classroom fills with an uncomfortable silence accompanied by the sound of a beating heart. One of the bullies punches Miwa, but his reaction is so quick that he finishes him off on the floor and with his hand full of blood starts to burn her face. The screams of the boys were heard throughout the hallways, so a teacher went to see what was happening, to which he found the horrible scene of the three unconscious students in the middle of the classroom. For, after all, Miwa is different from the others. Chapter 2. Later, the protagonist's sister receives a call to inform her that he has lost control again. But the most worrying thing is that now they must act fast to hide his powers, or else the Garden will come after the boy. Hyuna meets with her informant to pick up some kind of drugs that are guaranteed to alter the memories of those involved. But the mysterious man makes it clear to her that this is the most he can do for her, and that if in the future they find her brother with all the evidence against him, he will not be able to do anything to help them. So with this in mind, Hyuna goes to the hospital to supply the medicine to the boys, making all this a simple mistake of the past. A few years later, we see that the incident was completely forgotten, as Miwa is now a young man in his 22nd who works in a store in his town. After a while, a group of young people arrives to buy some food, and one of them recognizes the protagonist of that incident that happened at school, only that his version talks of a somewhat violent fight they had during classes. This boy starts to bother Miwa about whether the blood still activates his killer instincts, and in a somewhat aggressive reaction, he asks him if by any chance he is a parasite, which in a few words are bugs disguised as humans who go around the world killing people. But before the argument becomes more violent, a friend ends up separating them and they leave the place, insulting Manhwa for supposedly being a monster. In the afternoon, when he was on his way back home, Manhwa tells us that all his life he has had this fear of blood, so to avoid any kind of accident, he has sought methods to prevent himself from getting hurt, such as replacing books and paper with electronic devices or trying to ignore all kinds of contact sports. All this pressure has cost him much of his social life, especially with the accident he had in high school. But Manhwa tries not to give up because there is one person who still needs him, his sister. At home, Hyuna receives the protagonist with a surprise, as today turned out to be his 20th birthday. At first, he is surprised to see all this, as apparently he forgot his date. Hyuna sees that he has the tablet in his hand, so she takes it out to see what new things have been drawn. But to her bad luck, it's just blood-colored scribbles. Manhwa thinks he's going to get in trouble for this, but to her surprise, she reacts in a rather strange way, telling him that her red-filled artwork appeals to him. This was the trigger for the protagonist to realize that he was not with his sister because she has always hated red and has tried to avoid it as much as possible because of Miwa's condition. The room is filled with disturbing sounds, revealing the true identity of the thing that had taken Hyuna's body, as she is now a parasite. He tries to run as far as he can but is finally caught by one of the monster's claws. The parasite tries to suffocate him and almost succeeds when out of nowhere someone appears to cut off one of its limbs. But in the process, he also makes Manhwa bleed. Chapter 3. The battle intensifies, so the butterfly must use one of her blades to end the bug's life. After verifying that the beast is indeed dead, we meet Jaeyoung, a butterfly soldier working together with Sarah, a technology from the garden. She reports that the mission has been completed, but before leaving she wants to check on Miwa's condition, as has just seen what used to be her sister killed. Jaeyoung approaches to ask her if she is okay, but the impact of the moment was such that the protagonist does not respond to any signal from the girl. She becomes impatient and ends up raising her voice, but before doing anything, she realizes that Miwa's hand is bleeding too much. The garden's communications center tries to send an ambulance to the scene to attend to the injured man. But while trying to communicate with his butterfly, the protagonist reacts to seeing all the blood on the place, and with his overhuman strength grabs Jaeyoung by the neck. After a moment of struggle and madness on Miwa's part, she manages to free herself from his hands with a kick and with her weapon decides to knock him out before the boy reacts again. At the same time in the garden, Dr. Eugen Seo requests Jaeyoung to bring the guy back to the labs and finally reveals that Manhwa is the fourth butterfly that had gone missing years before. As he is transported to the facility, we see how in his subconscious he has a conversation with his deceased sister, in which they talk about how, unlike other young people, he will always have to live a life apart from society. And although it is unfair that this is the only option he has if he doesn't want everyone around him to die. In the end, this becomes more of a nightmare that ends up waking him up in what appears to be the garden hospital. And sure enough, a few seconds later Jaeyoung enters accompanied by Sarah Lopez, a 27-year-old researcher who is in charge of the Butterfly Army issue. Also, the one who welcomes him back to his real home. Chapter 4. Sarah shows him the facilities of the garden, with all the laboratories it has, the adjoining areas, and the bedroom where the butterflies live. Also explains that the original body of the goddess is preserved in the laboratory of the current director, in a special area called the Central Garden. But there you cannot enter without special permission. After a while they pass by the second laboratory, where most of the researchers are surprised to see Manhwa, since as Sarah explains, they are all intrigued to meet the fourth butterfly because they thought they were only going to have 3 copies of the goddess. So when they hear that there is still one last descendant, the news surprised the whole garden. Manhwa gets a little uncomfortable with the attention and stops for a moment to ask them a few questions. First, he talks about how it's confusing that he's a butterfly, since supposedly, these humanoids have different blood colors representing them. But he still has red blood. Also, another thing that is not clear to him is why, if he belongs to this group, he lived his life apart from the garden, since these children are born and grow up in this place. But undoubtedly what most generates intrigue is if Hyuna knew all these years that he was a butterfly. The place is filled with an awkward silence, and Sarah as gently as possible tries to explain the truth to him. To begin with, she explains that he must be the fourth butterfly of the red blood, and although it is hard to believe his inhuman power is proof of the fact that he is part of this species. Jaeyoung tells him about why he doesn't remember anything from the age of 13, telling us that the existence of the fourth butterfly was always a secret in the garden, as only certain researchers were aware of its development. However, one day, exactly 7 years ago, one of the scientists betrayed the organization and kidnapped the boy to hide somewhere in the city. Sarah finally explains to him that the response was Huena Beek, the woman who pretended to be his older sister. Manhwa doesn't want to accept the truth, as for him her version of events is completely different. But Jae-young explains that maybe Huena had her reasons for altering her memories. As being a researcher for the garden, obtaining a drug that can erase her past had to be an easy job. He is shocked after hearing the whole story. But one thing still doesn't make much sense, and that is why his fake sister took such a big risk to hide a butterfly for so long. Sarah also fails to understand very clearly the reason for Huena's betrayal. But the version that seems most convenient is that she simply wanted the boy to live a normal life, since the butterflies that are raised in the garden must go through a fairly strong training, which in the view of other people is even considered as mistreatment. Manhwa is bewildered by all this, as it is a lot of information to process, but Sarah tries to reassure him that he doesn't need to feel lonely. For as much as it is bad, he is home again, and everyone in the lab will try to do their best to make him feel welcome. These words comfort Manhwa, who now knows his true identity as the fourth butterfly, and asks him whether bugs is enough to make people love him. Sarah feels that this question is a bit weird, so she tries to answer him in the best way. But Jae-young does get angry upon hearing this, so she ends up punching him in the face. Chapter 5. She continued to struggle with Manhwa and shout at him that he is inconsiderate for thinking about such things when he still can't even control his powers. Also knowing very well that now the city is going through a difficult situation, as the bugs continue to multiply daily. Jae-young gets very serious about the crisis that the garden is going through, because at the end of the day, his responsibility is to keep the lives of thousands of residents safe, and the way things are going, they are running out of options, revealing that he has run out of butterfly goddess blood, so there is only a reduced army to deal with this problem. In closing, she makes it clear to him that he was brought to the facility because he is their last hope for dealing with the bugs, so he must take things seriously if he wants to be treated kindly by the researchers. Otherwise, if he turns out to be useless during the missions, he will be discarded from the lab and no one will ever remember the name of the fourth butterfly again. Jae-young leaves the place very angry, so Sarah tries to apologize for the whole scene the girl made. To her surprise, Manhwa is quite calm. But there is one thing that made him uneasy about everything they discussed, and that is the part that he must earn his stay in the place or else he will be kicked out like garbage. Sarah tries to explain to him in a slightly calmer manner that technically that is true because if the garden staff doesn't deem him fit for combat, no matter how much of a butterfly he is, he will end up being eliminated from the team and the lab. All these words make Manhwa reflect, and with a very determined attitude she asks Sarah to finish giving her the tour of the place. And with a very kind smile, she tells her that if she wants to work hard to earn her stay as a butterfly, first she has to know the place where she is going to live from now on. After a short walk, they pass by the guard room, a specialized area where the scientists handle and assist the butterflies during their missions. And further on they finally arrive at the butterfly pavilion, the dormitory where the rest of the guys reside, and where Manhwa is now going to live. The style of a traditional Korean house is what stands out most in the place, so the protagonist asks her about the second and third butterfly, to which Sarah replies that for the moment they are on a mission, so they will probably arrive the day after tomorrow. She also mentions that tomorrow he will be presented only to the laboratory staff, and that his official presentation to the public will be next week, so for the moment he can settle in his room and rest before continuing with his training. And as a final piece of information, Sarah tells him that he will not be assigned missions until his weapon is finished, explaining that all the butterflies have one, since their power comes from blood. They need to have a tool with which to materialize this element. Also that each weapon is unique for each butterfly, since the four have different types, colors, and blood abilities. Manhwa understands her situation, so she thanks Sarah very much for her help, to which she only asks her to please not resent Jae-young because although she may seem a bit angry and compulsive, she is simply a girl who has a great sense of responsibility, as she feels all the pressure of being the first butterfly in the garden. He tells her that he doesn't hold any grudges, which reassures Sarah, who gives Manhwa her things, including the key to her new room, before leaving. Already in his room, he still does not process the fact that he is the fourth butterfly, let alone that he is now living in a state-of-the-art scientific facility, so he thinks it's all a dream. But in the end, he realizes that in reality, His new life started thanks to the blood he was always avoiding, recognizing that now he has the power to save the world in his hands. Manhwa lies down for a while to think about what Hyuna had to go through to try to give him a normal life away from all these problems, leaving now a lot of unanswered questions. So he better decides to sleep to be ready tomorrow. However, later that day, we see that someone mysteriously enters his room, saying the phrase that a new larva has arrived in the garden. Chapter 6. The next day, the director of the facility makes the presentation of the fourth butterfly to all the researchers of the place, saying that finally, the child they had lost so long ago has returned home and that now the pressure the garden had regarding public safety is solved, because apparently, they see him as their last hope. After a long talk, Dr. Seo thanks Manhwa for his cooperation on stage, reminding him again that they expect a lot from him in the future, and that they know he will be a great help in their fight against the bugs. The boy tries to express his concern about her new role as a butterfly, since he has most of his life he lived as a normal person, and doesn't know if he will be able to carry all that responsibility. But Dr. Seo replies that knows he will do well because all butterflies have a special talent that serves to help others. Sarah also arrives to congratulate him on his presentation and to introduce him to the group of researchers who will be working in support of the butterfly missions. They all receive him in a very friendly way, so to integrate a little more, they go to eat and talk for a while. After a few hours, Sarah and the others return to work, leaving Manhwa alone, who reflects on how his life has changed completely, that he is now living with more people than just Hyuna. Only that while he was walking back to his bedroom, he overheard in the distance a conversation between a few researchers who said not to trust him as the fourth butterfly, since in the garden is present the rumor that Manhwa still does not know how to control his powers, something that can compromise the operations against the bugs. But undoubtedly what leaves him more disconcerted is the fact that it is believed that Dr. Seo is hiding something because all the information about the fourth butterfly is classified material. Not even Manhwa knows anything about where he was born or how he got his powers, since having his memories altered, he cannot control the force he keeps inside him, generating a fear that he may lose control again in the middle of the battle. All this leaves him pensive because if he fails to be of use in the missions, he will have to go back to living in Hyuna's now abandoned apartment and keep his low profile of not approaching other people for fear of hurting them. But before he completely breaks down emotionally, he remembers Dr. Seo's words that his powers are to save others and give them hope, and not a destructive weapon. Manhwa is convinced that from now on there is no turning back and he must follow his destiny to be the fourth butterfly of the garden, promising himself that he will have to work twice as hard to earn his place in the lab. With this in mind, he decides to return to his room to begin his transformation. But out of nowhere, a blue mist surrounds him, creating an uneasy atmosphere, which in the end gives way to a bug that attacks Manhwa to death. Chapter 7. The monster leaves the boy lying on the floor, who begins to despair thinking that seeing his blood will make him lose control again. But he realizes that in fact, he is not bleeding. Moreover, he is not even hurt by the bug's supposed attack. A voice in the distance tells him that he has nothing to worry about, since it didn't hurt him, and with this, the blue mist begins to disappear, generating a boy, who laughs when he sees Manhwa's scared face because of what just happened. He finally introduces himself as Hajin Seo, the second butterfly, with the ability to generate a gas that causes hallucinations to his enemies and thus distracts them during combat. Hajin apologizes for the practical joke he played on him a moment ago, but in reality, it was something he wanted to do since he saw him because no one in the lab falls for his tricks anymore. So having a new member in the team, he found no better way to welcome him than with an illusion of a bug. They talk for a while, to which Hajin tells him that he is surprised by Manhwa's courage to have faced a butterfly as strong as Jaeyoung because everyone is so afraid of that girl because of how strong she is. He also tells her about how he managed to control his impulse to lose control a bit when he saw the fake blood, concluding that he doesn't control his powers by seeing the blood. It's actually when he's aware that he's bleeding, so it can be assumed that his rampages are caused by some kind of psychological trauma. Hajin finally tells him that maybe and now he doesn't remember any of those things because his memories are altered from the age of 13 onwards. However, their conversation is interrupted by Sarah, who scolds him for making such jokes to the newcomer, as she is worried that Manhwa won't want to continue working for the garden if he doesn't feel comfortable. In the end, she takes him away because Hajin never reported the results of his mission, so now he must get to work. The two say goodbye to Manhwa, who doesn't quite understand how this relationship between the investigator and butterfly works. But what intrigues her the most is what they mention to her about a possible past trauma. Manhwa decides to go rest in her bedroom, But the next morning Sarah arrives to tell her that she is finally going to start her training to know how to use her blood in combat. Chapter 8. She tells him that this initiative started from what Hajin mentioned about the hypersensitivity he has towards blood. To be more specific, the rampages Manhwa has when he sees it. So after analyzing it for a while, they do not rule out the possibility that this could be due to some psychological trauma. That is why the whole team, they have decided to start with training therapy, and also to have more data about the mental state of the fourth butterfly. In the lab, one of the researchers explains to her that she will first use her imagination to recreate certain scenes, and that depending on the results, they will gradually increase the intensity of the psychological simulations. But before starting the tests, the girl asks him about what he feels when he thinks about the color red or when the word blood is mentioned, to which Manhwa responds that it does not cause him any discomfort to think about these things. He ends up telling her about the red drawings he made on his tablet. After a long while, they leave the laboratory, and Sarah takes advantage of the fact that they are alone to ask him what he thought of today's therapy, to which Manhwa tells him that he feels that this is not going to work, but he will keep on trying. Sarah tells him that this is a matter of time, so he must be patient in his process, so until he gets a more concrete result. She gives him a kind of special sedative that will help him to control his rampage moments, warning him to ingest it only in emergency cases since its effect is quite strong even for a butterfly. As the days go by, Manhwa keeps repeating the same therapy process, and although at certain points feels he is making some progress, he still can't control himself when sees his blood, so he starts to doubt if he's skipping some important points during his training. This new doubt torments him for a while since Manhwa has realized that it is only his blood that torments him and provokes his rampages, as has found that seeing other people bleed does not bother him at all. While he looks at himself in the mirror, a voice tells him that is afraid of him, but that it is only a part that resides inside him. And at the end of this sentence, the voice disappears. Also, he is interrupted by Hajin, who asks him if he wants to play cards with him. After several weeks, Manhwa arrives one night from training, where again feels that he hasn't made any progress. But more importantly, his roommate made a mess because drank too much and fell asleep in the middle of the room. He tries to clean up a bit and pick up the bottles, but accidentally knocks over the table and glass cuts part of his arm. Manhwa's heart starts to race, and again the voice inside reminds him that it is part of his being. But to his good fortune, Hajin wakes up and heals his wound. The two talk about what happened, until they realize that Manhwa didn't lose control or have a rampage, which fills him with happiness as he has just proved to himself that his training is indeed paying off. Later, Jae-young arrives, who looks quite tired from her work as Butterfly, so for this reason, she refuses to spend time with the three of them. Also because she still looks a little upset with Manhwa for what he said for weeks, implying that this is a game for him. All this leaves him pondering, because Manhwa wants to show the girl that he is not completely useless, so the next morning, takes Jae-young by surprise and asks her to please let him accompany her on a mission. Chapter 9. She gets angry when hearing this because she thinks that the boy is saying it as a joke. But although Jae-young insists that he can't take him because he doesn't know how to use his powers yet, also because he doesn't even have a weapon to defend himself, Manhwa persists that he wants to go and see how it is to fight face to face against the bugs, because maybe if he sees her act in combat, he will lose little by little the fear that he still has for his blood. Hajin also tries to convince him not to go because he doesn't have a weapon yet, and he might get a rampage in the middle of the mission. Manhwa keeps all this in mind, but he still insists on going because he doesn't want to feel useless forever. Jae-young realizes the effort the boy wants to make, so he agrees to take him on his mission, only on the condition that he stays away from combat. They both go to report to Sarah about the decision they have made, and although she at first objects to the fact that he is not yet named an official butterfly, Dr. Seo authorizes their departure on the mission together. Sarah has no choice but to accept her superior's orders, so with much concern for what will happen to Manhwa, she asks him to please stay in a safe place and always carry his special sedative on hand. Already on site, the data says that the last sighting of the bug was in the middle of the street, near the SINSA building. 4 wounded were reported in the area, which was already evacuated from the area, so he has permission to attack the target, which in this case are 3 ordinary bugs of regular sizes. Jae-young spots the beasts, so he decides to summon his weapon and start the hunt, but not before asking Manhwa to stay back, or else he will be the first thing his scythe cuts. Jae-young moves quite agilely amid the bugs and manages to finish off the smaller ones in a couple of seconds. But out of nowhere on his back appears the biggest of them all, so he must concentrate on taking it down quickly. Meanwhile, Manhwa observes from afar the girl's movements, admiring her efficiency and wishing someday to reach that level. However, for some reason his arm starts to bleed, so to avoid any rampage, he decides better to take the sedative at once before things get out of control. The situation seemed to be under control inside, only to be unexpectedly attacked by a bug. Chapter 10. To her good fortune, Jae-young arrives just in time to stop the monster's attack, but part of her body loses balance and ends up being hurt by one of its claws, leaving her seriously injured in her shoulder. The garden sees the situation through the cameras, so they decide to call the reinforcements. But while that happens, Manhwa tries as best he can to remove the claw from his partner's body, but the bug is stronger than both of them, so the boy has no choice but to cut his hand and temporarily activate his powers. Manhwa puts his hand on top of the beast, which ends up pushing the bug away because of the burning sensation. Jae-young warns her that she won't be able to hold him off for long, as she needs to use her weapon to defeat him. But with her man in that state, she won't be able to give him an accurate cut that will kill him. The situation escalates as the bug throws himself on top of Manhwa, who in a second of desperation hears the voice inside her reminding her that he is part of her being, that the two of them are one, so she simply has to imagine what she wants to do and they will both make it happen. Manhwa reacts in time and transforms his blood into a spear that pierces the bug in half. Jae-young along with the lab staff are surprised that a butterfly can shape its blood. But being the first time the boy does something like this, he ends up losing control, generating another spear that went against the monster that was already dead. All this overexertion knocks out Manhwa, who faints in the middle of the street along with Jae-young, who had already lost too much blood by that time. Chapter 11. As the ambulances arrive in time to transport their butterflies back to the garden, the researchers in charge of the boys discuss with Dr. Seo the fact that the fourth butterfly can create weapons from their blood, since they have always provided the tools for them to use their blood as a conductor, but not as a physical weapon. On the table is the discussion that genetically, the four should be the same, since they are all descendants of the same specimen, which in this case is the butterfly goddess. Taking all this into account, Dr. Seo tells them that the blood of butterflies remains a mystery, since being mixed with different types of beings, it can unlock a hidden potential, as in this case, to create weapons from this substance. So he ends up declaring that Manhwa is a specimen with a unique ability. After analyzing all this, the director authorizes the official departure of the fourth butterfly to the mission to fight the bugs. Since no weapon is needed, it can begin to improve its skills directly on the battlefield. The rest of the researchers try to oppose the idea, because they have not yet fully examined their rampages. But Dr. Seo only repeats to them that the boy is ready, because he cannot wait to try to be perfect, but must start acting now. The room ends in total silence, ending the meeting with that the fourth butterfly will start with his work as long as he is 100% recovered, highlighting that Manhwa has just exceeded the expectations that the director of the garden had. Meanwhile, in the infirmary of the facility, the boy wakes up clearly remembering what happened in the city, but mostly asking himself if everything he did was a survival impulse because he was about to die. He compares the feeling he has now to finally feeling part of what is flowing through him. But his moment of reflection is interrupted by Sarah, who with tears in her eyes is happy to see that her boy is safe and sound. She expresses to him the worry she had during the fight, as ever since Jae-young was injured, she had a constant fear of losing them both on the spot. After a while, Hajin also appears and explains how surprised everyone was to see how he controlled the situation against the bug, highlighting that it was too epic the moment when he created his blood weapon to end the fight. After Sarah scolded Hajin for smoking in the middle of the hospital, she gives Manhwa the good news that because of his great bravery on the battlefield, he has been officially named a butterfly, also having already been assigned his first mission as part of the team. She tries to tell him that she wanted to give him a little more time to adjust to what it takes to be such a soldier. But the boy responds with a sincere smile, telling her that he is glad that now he will finally be someone that people may come to need. They both understand Manhwa's happiness at finally achieving what he has been longing for, so all they give him is the advice that he should continue to constantly strive to improve as a butterfly, as he still has a lot to learn. Manhwa thanks them for their support, but interrupts the conversation for a moment to ask about Jae-young, as she wants to visit him after all. Back in his room, the girl tries to avoid being seen, to which he thanks her from afar for saving him during the mission, and apologizes for her man, as Manhwa feels that she ended up like this because of him. Jae-young inwardly keeps these words to herself but makes something quite clear to the boy, and that is that she doesn't need him. It may be that now the garden wants to investigate him more because he can generate weapons with her blood, but at least to her, he is just someone else on the team, not to say that he is a complete nuisance. Manhwa leaves the room at Jae-young's request, but before she leaves, she ends up telling him two things. The first is to apologize for attacking her the first time they met, and the second is to ask her not to say she doesn't need him because at the end of the day. Hearing that hurts a little. The latter leaves Jae-young thinking, who looks at the spot on his shoulder and ends up having a slight flashback to when he was young. Chapter 12. She begins to tell us that since she started her work as the first butterfly, little by little she found the negative side of having to face the bugs every day. And now that she is older, she ended up hating everything. The beasts, the people, the world in general. But what she hates most of all is herself. Here we go back 5 years ago when a large bug attacked the city. Jae-young as a butterfly went on a mission to save a young girl from being eaten by one of these things. Jae-young managed to eliminate the beast, only we discover that the color of her blood is black. And at that time she was strongly criticized for this, even generating offensive comments against her, which in the end hurt her inside, because she only wanted to help people. However, within all this darkness, she always had the support of Sarah, being the only person who never disliked the color of her blood, and who always congratulated her when she completed a mission. But despite everything, Jae-young since that day generated insecurity inside her, referring to herself as a creature who was never destined to live a normal life, since she chose to be a heroine because she was simply born like that. Back in the present, Manhwa was practicing the control of his new powers, as he wants to feel ready for his first mission. Sarah comes to interrupt him for a moment to congratulate him on the accelerated progress he has made in such a short time and asks him not to overexert himself too much, as he has just come out of his recovery in the hospital. Manhwa tells her that she has nothing to worry about, so to change the subject, he asks her to please take him back to his old house because he wants to pick up some things that were left behind. Sarah is a bit worried, as this might end up being a strong emotional blow for Manhwa, but to her surprise, the boy took it quite maturely. Already in the apartment, he recalls the moments he spent there with Hyuna, and although for a moment he enters a melancholic state, he does not take long to gather his things and promises his late sister that he will give his best to fit into his new home, asking her to watch from wherever she is, as he begins his new life as the fourth butterfly. As Manhwa walks back to the lab, he says goodbye for the last time to the most iconic places in the neighborhood where he lived most of his life when out of nowhere some boys recognize him. But being completely covered, they are not recognizable at first glance, but as we go into more detail, we see that one of them is the boy who suffered the accident at school. Chapter 13. At the same time in the lab, Jae-young tries to get up from the hospital bed, but Sarah stops her because her results show that she is not fully recovered yet. She tries to disobey the doctor's orders, but finally they manage to convince her that her mission will be delegated to another butterfly so that she can recover quietly these days. Jae-young accepts the deal, and when he is on his way back to his room, Sarah asks him to do her a special favor. Back with Manhwa, the boys start beating him repeatedly as revenge for what happened years ago. He tries to avoid having to fight any way he can, so he apologizes for what he did to her face. But since the boys' memories were erased at the time by Hyuna, their versions of events are not entirely clear, but they still want to do something similar to him so that he suffers the same pain they went through at the time. After a while, we see that Sarah's favor to Jae-young is to go out to see if Manhwa was okay because, despite everything, she was worried about sending him only to his old house, where he was possibly going to have quite a few sad memories of his old life. She also visited one of the doctors in charge of the garden for a moment. Although Jae-young at first feels angry for wasting her time and having to take care of Manhwa as if he were a baby, finding him cornered by the who also tried to mess with her, she ends up giving them the beating they needed to calm down once and for all. Chapter 14. The boys try to threaten her that they will share on social media the actions she was doing to tarnish her reputation. But Jae-young doesn't care about any of this, because she stopped caring about what people say about her life a long time ago. She was ready to deliver the final blow to the abuser when out of nowhere Manhwa snatches him away to make him remember with his bare hands what happened to his face years ago. As they ran away seeing that they were facing two butterflies, Jae-young tells her that she didn't have to do that, as she was ready to teach them the lesson that those bastards needed. But Manhwa replies that she was only trying to take care of her shoulder. In the end, she is still in the process of recovery. Now, on the way to the doctor's cafeteria, the boy sees that Jae-young's hand was bleeding a lot, so he tries to give her his handkerchief so that she can clean it. But she reacts badly because of her trauma of feeling hated for having black blood. However, Manhwa cares little about this, telling him as an excuse that her hand is also dirty, so she shouldn't worry about feeling uncomfortable in front of him. She briefly mentions to him that she hates his blood because of its color, but doesn't give Manhwa a chance to respond, as she tells him that they are on their way to buy a cake to eat. Already at the place we meet Grandma Sujin, one of the few people that Jae-young cares about and above all makes her feel happy. Granny bothers her that the boy is her boyfriend, so to clear up the misunderstanding, she explains that Miwa is just a friend and a co-worker, but he also takes the moment to make her a little uncomfortable, saying that he is the disciple of Boss Jae-young. While Sujin goes to get the girl's favorite cake, Miwa sees the same dessert that Hyuna bought on her 20th birthday. And seeing the good relationship that these two have even though they are not direct family, all the emotional burden he feels at not having that person who also loved him anymore, ended up in Miwa running out of the place without saying a single word. Chapter 15. On the way out of the coffee shop, Jae-young didn't understand what was going on in the boy's head. But upon finding him crying in the middle of the street, she realized that something wasn't right. Miwa tells him that she is very lucky to still have someone important to her, to which she tells him that actually, Grandma Sujin was a researcher at the garden years ago, but now she is retired and as a hobby runs a coffee shop. Jae-young tells her that although they are not related in blood, she still considers her part of her family because, like Sarah, they were the only ones who respected her without judging her for having black blood. Miwa understands the past that her friend had to live through being the first butterfly, so she tells her why she ran out of the place, and in a few minutes she went for the cake that was on the counter, commenting that it is the same dessert that Hyuna brought her the day she was transformed into a parasite. All these words leave Jae-young thinking, who realizes that in the end, Miwa ended up staying alone. And even though he had the normal life she always wished for, they are not as different as she thought. The two talk for a while about how it's technically not her fault that she was born this way, causing Jae-young to become sentimental, confessing that she hates it and at the same time envies it, because other people have always seen her only as an object that loves to fight, but no one has stopped to see how she might feel inside. Also, ever since he found out that Hyuna was responsible for getting him out of the garden, he started to imagine what would have happened if she was the girl who escaped, wondering if maybe his life would have been different. Jae-young ends up bursting into tears, calling herself pathetic and useless. But Miwa comes clean by telling him that as much as she has envied him, he has always felt the same way about her, because he doesn't feel like an intuitive person. On the contrary, the only thing he could feel when he saw her on TV was admiration. He tells her that the powers that he hates so much have saved thousands of lives, and that is why most people feel great respect for her work because they are amazed to see how a young girl carries so much responsibility. Miwa ends up explaining to her that she may not be able to understand perfectly how she may feel, but that despite everything, from now on she has a person she can trust to tell her all her problems or simply let off steam. The two share a nice moment where they get a little upset about crying in front of each other, but at the end of the day, the two strengthen their friendship even more, reaching a new level of trust that they both seem to like. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Hajin is on a mission with none other than the third butterfly, Jiraiya. Chapter 16. Already in the garden, we see that the news of the fourth butterfly caused quite an impression in the media. Also, there is a video circulating on social networks of Miwa fighting a bug, so the arrival of the boy to the team has generated very good acceptance by the people of Seoul. Sarah comments that while Jae-young is resting in the hospital, he will have to take charge of his first official mission, since they unexpectedly received a report of a bug in the middle of an urban area, so they need reinforcements from the butterflies to put an end to the plague. At the Manhwa bridge, Miwa and Hajin arrive to analyze the situation, and later we are introduced to Jiraiya, an 18-year-old girl who is the third butterfly on the team. She talks rather enthusiastically about how much she wanted to meet him in person, as when she heard that there is a fourth butterfly, she felt quite excited to have a new co-worker. However, their conversation is interrupted by a sudden attack from the bugs. But we see that out of nowhere, she uses her weapon to wipe them out, as her special ability is that through her blood, she channels enough of it to create an electric shock that wipes out enemies in a matter of seconds, which is why most know her as the Electric Girl. Miwa explains that she has to recharge her attacks, just like a battery, and that in general, she does not always manage to finish off the bugs with a single blow since this depends a lot on the intensity of the discharge, and the size of the monster, so sometimes she has to give more than one blow to kill them. All this ended up leaving them no time to be able to give a counterattack, so Hajin uses his blood to generate the illusion that the street is empty, and thus able to allow them to arm their defense. The plan works perfectly, as this gives her the perfect time gap to recharge her blood and send a shock that now ends up killing the bugs. Miwa realizes how perfectly synchronized the second butterfly's powers are with those of the third, since while Hajin creates the illusion, Jay can recharge her attacks as many times as necessary. The three of them report that the mission was completed, but Manhwa senses someone's presence in the distance, being that on the other side of the river, a shadow was watching them from afar. Chapter 17. The three of them go back to the lab, but we realize that the relationship between Hajin and Jay is not alright, because he ends up treating her as if she were a child just because she is younger than him. The two start an argument about her being a liar, because when Hajin calls her by her real name, Siho, she ends up running away from the place in anger. Manhwa goes after her to see if she was alright, to which Siho unloads all his anger, saying that he has always been inconsiderate of the feelings of others, but above all, he has such a hostile attitude only against her. After a while, their talk is interrupted by Sarah, who informs them that there is a new report of a bug in the area. Only in this case it is a parasite. After exploring for a while, they find the creature absorbing the blood of one of its victims because, as Siho explains, the parasites must feed in this way to survive and gain more strength. Also because the blood of the bugs is like a kind of poison against the body of humans, this being the main reason why they must be constantly changing blood to maintain their humanoid form, thus making them the #1 priority to annihilate. Siho tries to attack with one of his charged attacks, but having to carry so much energy through his weapon, his mobility against a parasite is quite problematic. However, this was all a trap so that Manhwa can generate a spear with his blood to defeat him from behind. But before he dies, he says that a certain Jay will take revenge on all the butterflies for killing his kind. Manhwa doesn't understand anything of what the parasite was saying, so Siho explains to him that they have already heard the name Jay several times. So in the garden, they came to the conclusion that they must be referring to the current king of the bugs. Chapter 18. Siho says that this type differs from the rest of the species because it is the only one that has a core, which is more or less similar to a heart or a brain for humans. It is thanks to this feature that the king can generate more bugs from its core. So with this information, the garden supports the hypothesis that if they manage to break the core of Jay, maybe they would exterminate all the monsters on the planet, since they are only fragmentations of the original king. The only problem with this is that they do not know in which part of the body the core can be found. So the work of the butterflies is to try to kill most of the bugs to analyze their biology and continue to generate clues that serve as a solution to this problem. As a last piece of information, they establish that Jay, being the king of the bugs, is the one who sends them to wreak havoc in the city and imposes the rules to kill humans, because according to the theory he has so far, this works as a hive mind, which in a few words is that the beasts only follow the instructions of their leader through the core. At the same time, Sarah from the lab asks Jay if by any chance the bug they killed recently has no more clues to Jay's whereabouts, since apparently this parasite was working for him. But in the end, they find nothing useful, so they end up returning to the garden's facilities. On the way to the place, Manhwa thinks that it would be too beneficial to defeat the king and thus reclaim the core, because once this is done, they would be able to return the peace that the world needs so much. Jay notices that the boy is quite thoughtful about the subject, so to break the ice between the two, they try to talk about the relationship that she and Hajin have, because a few hours ago they proved not to get along well, even though there is a lot of synergy between them. However, the conversation is interrupted by a sudden reaction that Manhwa has, as he feels that someone or something is watching him again, and seconds later he receives the attack of a bug. The parasite breaks the communicator that Jay had in her ear, so it ends up cutting the signal between the butterfly and the garden. The mysterious man says that he has finally found the little green girl who tried to capture him, giving him the necessary clues for Jay to deduce that he is face to face with Jay, the king of the bugs. Chapter 19. The girl tries to give him a direct hit with one of her shocks, but Jay's speed is superior to her attacks. The rage completely blinds Jay's reasoning, and without thinking twice or analyzing that maybe the parasite is setting a trap for them, goes after him to try to capture him. Sarah asks Manhwa as a favor not to leave her companion alone, because Jay must have something in his hands to appear so suddenly. Jay manages to immobilize Jay with a kick, but despite all the tiredness she had accumulated from her previous battles, she tries to give the parasite one more shock. But again, the king's speed is superior in every way, so he ends up cutting the butterfly's back, leaving her almost unconscious, and in the process, breaking her weapon so she can't get up anymore. On the other hand, Manhwa runs desperately through the streets trying to find her friend, when he happens to find her lying in a dumpster all covered in blood. He notifies the garden that she is injured, and immediately calls for reinforcements to the area. But what he did not take into account when he arrived at the place is that now he is in a direct duel against the king parasite. Jay from behind manages to give Manhwa a blow that leaves him lying against a column, and once all communications with the garden are cut off, Jay takes the opportunity to talk to the boy. The king tells him that he was waiting for a long time for his encounter with the fourth butterfly, since all this turned out to be part of a plan that he had prepared long before. Manhwa tries to defend himself with one of his weapons, but the parasite's reflexes manage to overcome the attack, and he ends up burying one of his claws so that the boy can no longer use his powers. Jay lets his guard down for a second as he says he's disappointed that good-for-nothings like them have been defeating his bugs, so he creates a perfect gap for Manhwa to defend himself and create a knife with his other arm. Jay is surprised to see how quickly the fourth butterfly learns, so he decides to take off the robe that was covering him completely and says it's time to start taking things more seriously. Chapter 20. A dark-haired, white-haired man comes into the light, giving Manhwa a pretty decent fight, who, as best he can, tries to defend himself from the swift attacks that Jay was launching. One of the kicks ends up breaking the boy's concentration, who seems to be running out of blood as his weapons disappear from his hands. After analyzing the situation that he is wounded, he is alone and there is no direct communication with the garden. Manhwa considers stopping fighting, since everything is against him, thinking that it is the end for him. However, although he tries to gather what little strength he has left by remembering the promise he made to Hyuna, Jay drives one of his claws directly into Manhwa's hand, leaving him now completely helpless and unable to control the situation. Before falling unconscious, he asks the king if killing him will end the war between humans and bugs, to which Jay replies that he is right, but tells him that if that is the case, the garden will stop using the butterflies and discard them as biological waste. The king continues attacking Manhwa mentally, telling him that maybe and for these reasons he does not want the monsters to disappear because then he will have a life surrounded by people who need him for something. Also tells him that if he thinks he is bad for controlling the bugs at will, he should first see the actions that the garden does, because in reality there is not much difference between what they do to keep this war afloat. Because, in the end, the butterflies are only puppets of public safety. Manhwa tries to resist Jay's blackmail, but Jay ends up using his powers to bring him some memories that the boy had hidden in his subconscious. So in brief outlines, we see certain things that happened years ago in the lab. To be more specific, the time when he was a child and training at the garden. All this awakens the blind rage that Manhwa had stored inside him, but the confrontation is interrupted by the reinforcements who came to rescue him, as Hajin used his abilities to turn him invisible, and thus lose sight of Jay. Chapter 21. Manhwa briefly recalls what she saw as a nightmare, so she ends up waking up with tremendous pain in her body and head at the garden hospital. Jae-young surprisingly keeps her company and tells her that she was unconscious for 3 days, during which she had repeated nightmares and talked a lot in her sleep. She explains that butterflies usually have a faster recovery than other people, as technically their organism is genetically altered. Manhwa takes advantage of this to ask her if she is feeling better from her man, to which Jae-young tells her that she feels completely fine. She comments on what happened during the fight, telling him that after he recovers, he should go and talk to Hajin, as he was the one who reassured him after having his encounter with Jay. Jae-young slyly tries to ask him how they got out alive after literally coming face to face with the king of the bugs, to which Manhwa tells him that it was simply because Jay didn't want to kill them, since with the power he currently has, without any problems he would have finished them off, but apparently that's not part of his plan. Jae-young asks him for more details of what happened after the garden lost communication with them, to which Manhwa, when he tries to recall, ends up with a severe headache that leaves him with nothing to remember but the images that Jay implanted in his brain, which apparently are the memories that the boy had repressed during all this time. Jae-young realizes the state of his companion, so before leaving, to cheer him up a little and help him in his recovery, he tells him that from now on he should not get into more trouble or get hurt because she also needs him by her side. After a while, Manhwa, worried about Jae's condition, goes to visit her in her room, but when he arrives he finds her sedated, lightly pronouncing SIA's name. The boy decides to visit her again the next morning, only this time he finds her sitting outside in the hospital courtyard. They both talk for a while about what happened during the mission and the confrontation with Jay, but Manhwa cuts the subject with a question that surprises the girl too much, since after analyzing everything that happened during these days and what she saw yesterday, she doubts who she is, if Jo or Siho. Chapter 22. She at first takes the question with grace, but seeing that she can't escape her past anymore, she ends up revealing that only certain people from the garden and a butterfly know about her real name, which is Siho Ryu, since she was using the identity of her twin sister, Ja, all this time. Manhwa doesn't quite understand what's going on, or why she would do something like that, so Siho is left with no choice but to tell the whole truth. She reveals that she is not the third butterfly as publicly stated, but that long ago she held the title of the fourth butterfly, and her sister was the third. Sadly, she died, so the garden decided to rename Siho and give her the place left by the twin. This leaves an awkward silence in the place, which ends with the girl asking Manhwa if he knows how butterflies are created. In a sort of flashback begins the story. Long before the bugs appear, the facilities of the garden were actually those of an orphanage, where from the outside it appeared to be a normal infant center, but inside, genetic experiments were already being carried out on the children, thus creating artificial humans, and thus be at the forefront in the issue of cloning. Having no test subjects in their experiments, the garden decided to create their laboratory pigs, and after much trial and error, the research resulted in a girl and two twins, namely Jaeyoung, Ja, and Siho. Manhwa interrupts the conversation to find out if this was where she was born, to which she explains that this was not the only experimentation center, as from data she discovered some time ago, she learned that in other areas of the city there were more laboratories disguised as orphanages. Siho explains that the three lived a fairly comfortable childhood, also because the adults who took care of them always sought their welfare and happiness, until the first reports of bugs arriving in the city appeared in a few weeks, and it was at this point when all the facade that the garden maintained crumbled, and the experiments they were doing with the blood of the, by that time already deceased, butterfly goddess came to light. Jaeyoung was the first successful specimen who obtained the necessary powers to fight against the monsters, and then followed Hajin, who despite not being born in the same place, was a key piece in the new army of butterflies, and finally came Ja and Siho, who obtained the title of third and fourth butterfly, who despite being twins and having the same blood running through their veins, the powers that each one had were completely different. Siho tells us that her sister was the first of the two to show true potential, as she had better control over her blood, while on the other hand, the other twin was not so lucky, reaching the point where the garden decided to keep their public presentation a secret until they showed some progress in their training. The world began to turn its eyes on Ja, as she was always a cheerful girl who stood out not only for her powers, but also for her natural glow as a person. All this ended up creating an insecurity in Siho, since being the complete opposite of her twin, she felt that she was the flawed version of her, and she always ended up comparing herself in a bad way with her sister. However, no matter what anyone else said about it, Ja always treated her sister with the love she deserved, because to her, her twin Siho was her whole world. Until that day came, when Siho wanted to make a nice gift for her sister, but when she entered the lab, she only found the unconscious body of the innocent Ja. Chapter 23. The side effects of all the experiments came sooner or later, so no researcher at the garden was able to predict that something like this would happen. After a few days, the lab decided to hide the news that Ja was dead, even forbidding giving her a funeral. But the real nightmare for Siho began when weeks later she was kidnapped against her will to begin experiments on her with the butterfly blood collected from her sister. In the end, and after several moments of suffering, Siho gave quite good results for the researchers, since in the end, she ended up gaining more strength than her sister had in her best times. The garden, seeing all this, ended up forcing Siho to take over her late twin's name and acquire the title of Jiraiya, the third butterfly. Manhwa was shocked to learn the story behind what happened to her sister, to which the girl tells her that at first she also didn't think she was strong-willed enough to be able to replace someone as brilliant as Ja. But at the end of the day, she had no choice but to adapt to her new life. Manhwa realizes that this indirectly ended up traumatizing Siho, as she now has to live a lie carrying the name of someone she is not. For in the end, she ended up accepting that it would have been better if Siho Ryu had never been born. Ja tells her that she was only born because of the garden's need, so she has no choice but to follow the orders of those who created her and gave her this power. Being this the reason why Hajin considers her a hypocrite who lives the life of a person who is already dead. Manhwa tries to find the right words with which he finally tells Ja that he will never understand what she had to live through. But what he can do is from now on treat her like a real person, promising her that there is no way he can ever hate her, ending with her not trying to repress that other part that will always live inside her. After a good talk, the boy says goodbye to Ja, who thanks him for listening to her all this time. Manhwa, with all this in mind, heads on his way to his room, when in a secluded place he comes across a broken mirror where he sees part of his reflection. Here he remembers Ja's words, what Jay told him at their meeting, and everything he has experienced during this crazy week. The question of who he is was going around in his head. But in the end he answers himself that he doesn't care in the least to think about it, because from now on, he just wants to go on his way, without needing to know everything that the garden hides about his past.